Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for tuning in to another Risk Institute online session. And today we're really lucky to have with us the wonderful Dr. Jazmin Scarlett, who will talk to us about her research on reconstructing the volcanic eruption in 1812 of La Soufrière in Saint Vincent. And the presentation will be around 45 minutes with around 15 minutes of Q&A. So please make sure your mics are muted and leave any questions in the chat. You can also enable subtitles if you like in the options in Zoom. So before we begin, I'd like to make a few announcements. On the 2nd of March at 2 p.m, we have our very own Alex Wimbush presenting on inference of diagnostic characteristics without a gold standard for disease status classification. And then in mid-March, we have the Ecotoxicology Symposium. We've yet to finalize the date, but we're in the process of planning that. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And then following that, near the end of the month, 23rd of March, we have Miss Ariana Casanova. And the 29th of March, we have Dr. Dalal Alwijer. So I'll be updating the titles in due course as they provide us their details. So without further ado, let us introduce our speaker. So Dr. Jazmin Scarlett is a historical and social volcanologist, researching how people lived in the past and the present with active volcanoes. Previous research has included the people and the volcanoes of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, Montserrat, Germany, and Italy. She also has interest in heritage studies, hazard analysis, disaster study concepts and theories, and science communication and outreach pedagogy. Dr. Scarlett did an undergraduate and BSc honours in geography and natural hazards at Coventry University, an MSc in volcanology and geological hazards at Lancaster University, and then did a PhD in earth science at the University of Hull. She's also been a visiting researcher at Aarhus University in Denmark and previously a lecturer in physical geography at Newcastle University. So without further ado, would you like to start sharing your slides, and welcome to our Risk Institute online session.
Yes, thank you. 1 second. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll just
we can see that.
hide you guys. Oh yes, needs to be presented here. Grand. Great. Well, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me. So today I'm going to be sharing a bit of my PhD research, focusing on the 1812 eruption of La Soufrière. So at the moment, within the last month, I did manage to get 2 jobs at once. So now I'm currently a senior research associate at East Anglia University, and I'm also a research assistant at Loughborough University. But my PhD at whole, I had a diverse supervisory team. So I had Rebecca Williams, who is the physical volcanologist, I had Greg Bankoff, who's an environmental historian, and I had Bryony McDonough, who's a historical and cultural geographer who specializes in feminist geographies. So I have a very diverse team, and all their expertise helped me produce my thesis, essentially, and how I thinking about how people live with volcanoes. So before again, I just want to give a brief overview of my territorial acknowledgement. So essentially, a species conducted on land that once belonged to an indigenous group called the Kalinago, and the Guafana, who are runaway slaves who intermarried with the Kalinago. And essentially, due to colonialism, they were forced closer to La Soufrière, and their descendants of those 2 groups have been at higher physical risk of La Soufrière ever since. And essentially, I've done my utmost best to present their voices in the narrative of the species and the history of the island and the volcano, as previously their voices were not presented in research. And before I begin properly, as some of you may know, there was a volcanic eruption that happened last year and the year before. So essentially, an overview of that, what happened is there was first confirmed sighting of a lava dome forming 27th December in 2020. And this essentially is with the gradual growth of this dome, it formed a crack in the dome, and then it was sustained gas plume, and there was increased seismicity on the 8th April. And on this day, there was an evacuation order for people in the red and orange zone. Here's the official volcanic hazard map for La Soufrière. So people in the red zone and orange zone were evacuated. And essentially the next day, on the 9th April, this transitioned into an explosive phase. So there were multiple pulses of explosions that started off as subplinian, similar to 1902 and 1812. And then about a few weeks later, it transitioned to a volcanian, Pilean eruption, explosions. Ashfall was reported on the whole island, as well as Barbados, St. Lucia, and Grenada. And ash was reported as far north as Montserrat. And there were occurrences of pyroclastic density currents and lahars. And I'll explain a bit more detail what this looks like in the context of 1812, but essentially these similar areas were impacted compared to 1812. So this is an interesting comparison to make. So here's just a bit more information about this dome slash coulée. So it became like an elongated kind of like mass that grew beside the post 1979 lava dome, which is here from the satellite image. It's kind of a photograph of what it looked like on the ground. And this was from the camera that was on the summit on the 8th of April. So this is where the sustained gas plume formed in this crack around here. And this was one of the explosions. I believe this was the 13th of April explosion. And as you see, it was widespread ash, and there was lahars that persisted well into the rainy season, which again is similar to other historical eruptions of La Soufrière in terms of the persistent volcanic hazards. Right, so what I'm going to do today is introduce you to my project, give a brief history of St. Vincent up to 1812, kind of like my mixed methods approach to reconstructing this event. Then about the first week of the eruption I'm going to cover before summary. So this was a historical social volcanology project, essentially looking at La Soufrière's eruptive history in the background of societal change. And I looked at the 1812 eruption, 1902, 1903, and 1979 eruptions. And this is interesting because each eruption occurred at 3 distinct stages of social development on the island. So 1812 happened during slavery, 1902 was post-emancipation, and then 1979 was on the eve of the island gaining independence from Britain. And this became one of my kind of like arguments in terms of the timing of the volcanic eruptions was key in terms of who was impacted and how. And so the main aims for the thesis was to reconstruct these events, to find out what happened during these 3 events, and then focus on the impacts on the agricultural sector. As for the 3 eruptions, agricultural sector was the main economic kind of provider for the island. And also any, if at all, any influences on societal behavior with living in a hazardous environment. So a brief history of St. Vincent. And of course, this is kind of the general map of the Eastern Caribbean, plus a bit of the Greater Antilles. Of course, this Google Maps doesn't do it justice, but here's kind of like layout there. So here's the crater up here. So the capital is Kingstown down here, but the first settlement was actually a French colonial settlement called Barrelly, and this is still an important area today, because in this area in particular, on the western side, there's a lot of people speak French patois, including my family, as my family comes from Barrelly. And this is just interesting to note because there is a mixture of French and British kind of like colonial influence on the island, and I will explain that in the brief history. So this is what the dome looked like when I last visited in 2016. So here's the 1979 dome. There was localized funeral activity. There's a small patch of water here. There's recent landslide activity. But all these green specks on the dome that's actually kind of like small trees and shrubs. So it's actually the post 1979 dome became quite a stable dome. But of course, the eruption happened, and now this is kind of what it looks like now. So interestingly, with this eruption, it's not only destroyed the 1979 dome and the 2020 dome, but it also actually deepened the crater. So it'll be interesting what research comes out of it in terms of how much energy is required to actually produce some of the hazards that influence the surrounding areas, as now that it will take more effort. Of course, I'm kind of personifying the volcano there, but it would take more energy to maybe produce some hazards to influence some areas. So St. Vincent has a rich archaeological history as a migratory island from South America. And what happened with this, so not only St. Vincent, it's the other Eastern Caribbean volcanic islands as well. And essentially what happened is one group coming out of South America would populate the Eastern Caribbean islands, and they would absorb and displace the older kind of like cultural group. So for example, we have evidence of a group called a Saladoid, and then they were absorbed and displaced by the Arawak. And then the Kalinago that come from Venezuela originally, they absorbed and displaced the Arawak. But things get a little bit more interesting if we zoom in. So it was discovered by Columbus in 1798, but was left alone as he sought natural resources elsewhere in the Americas. In 1626, there is a small presence of French colonists and slaves. And essentially during this time, the French and British colonial empires had invested interests in occupying St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but they met resistance from the Kalinago and the Guafana. In the 1640s, we have the Kalinago and Guafana of St. Vincent assisting efforts to the Kalinago in the Dominica and Martinique to try and fight the French occupation in Martinique, as at the time Martinique was the central hub for the indigenous populace for the Kalinago in the region. And in 1718, this is not working. What's going on? There we have the first recorded historical eruption of La Soufrière in 1718, but not much is known about it other than it happened. And this is interesting that I hopefully one day we can be able to explore more, because in 1719, we then have the establishment of Bar-Relief. So it's likely that French colonial archives has more of an idea of what happened. And it's probably just sitting there waiting. So if anyone has any sources of money that I can have to go to the colonial archives in France, that'd be awesome. Anyway, so in 1748, we have a treaty that declared St. Vincent's neutral and rightful property of the Kalinago and Guafana. So essentially met so much resistance that they thought, okay, we should probably leave it alone. However, something strange happens, because as a result of the 7 Years' War in America from 1756 to 1763, St. Vincent becomes seceded to Britain following the Treaty of Paris, and a reserve of the Kalinago and Guafana is established in the north, closer to La Soufrière. So essentially before colonial settlement, the Kalinago and Guafana, there's archaeological evidence for this for all the other Caribbean volcanic islands as well, is that they purposely lived away from the volcanoes, usually in the south end of the islands and on the coast. So they knew that these volcanoes were dangerous. But it's interesting because, of course, that region has a rich history of hurricanes and whatnot. But for them to live purposely away and on the coast, they saw that volcanoes were a larger threat compared to hurricanes that would happen year on year. So they had more understanding of how to deal with them. So around this time, from 1771 to 1808, there was approximately 57,500 enslaved Africans brought to St. Vincent. And in particular, in 1812, there was a recorded 18,050 slaves. This will be important to note later. During this time, once with British kind of like colonial occupation, the planter class, so those in charge of the sugar plantations, they attempted to secure land in the north because they realized that's where the fertile volcanic soil is. They attempted to secure land through voluntary sale, military force, and encroachment. And in retaliation, the Guafana and Kalinago fought back, and this resulted in the First Carib War of 1769 to 1773. In 1779, it was recaptured by French forces as part of the American Revolution campaign. In 1780, we have, we have a recorded tropical storm. And then in 1783, we have the treaty that ended the American Revolution, and St. Vincent was ceded back to Britain. Because the British were not very nice, this actually led to the Second Carib War in 1795 to 1797, and this resulted in the exile of just under 4,500 Guafana to present-day Honduras. And now those descendants populate the Central Americas. And in 1804, we have the largest plantation estates closest to La Soufrière started production because they're exiled, a lot of people of the Guafana that had those lands. And then in 1812, we have the volcanic eruption. So in terms of mixed methods approach, so a lot of my data came from qualitative archive data. So for example, this was letters. So here, for example, is a letter from the 9th of May, 1812 in Barbados. This was an admiral that was going to investigate what's going on in St. Vincent because ash was falling on Barbados, but they didn't know they didn't entirely know what's going on. But this letter describes that he had to turn back his ship and go back to Barbados because the downfall of volcanic ash was too much and reducing visibility. Also had diaries. So this is a diary from an American magistrate who was on the island, and he just casually sat on his veranda and just was watching this volcanic eruption happening. So it's interesting to get their perspective. And also we had geologists, field notebooks and historical research papers. This is more applicable for 1902 and 1979, as around in 1812, volcanology and geology wasn't really a scientific discipline per se. So we didn't have any expert kind of like understanding of that eruption. But here, for example, this is a notebook from an American geologist called Edmund Otis Hovey. And he was at the American Museum of Natural History as an assistant paleontologist. And he was instructed by the museum to go and investigate what was happening on St. Vincent as Martinique. And this was an alternative source due to the field notebooks of Dr. Tempest Anderson, who was a geologist. His notebooks have been lost, so I found these alternative sources. Historical maps. So this was mainly used for like land use and where certain settlements and plantations were, and just understanding the land better historically. And also just putting myself in the shoes of what if I was a volcanologist or an emergency manager in 1812, what kind of resources would I use and how would I utilize this map to understand what was happening? Governmental correspondence. So St. Vincent was part of the Windward Islands administration. So the governor of St. Vincent would send reports to kind of like the administrator based in Barbados, and the administrator would send correspondence back to Colonial Office in London. So there's actually quite a lot of reports in terms of investigations from a political perspective and from engineers that were kind of like instructed to go and investigate what's going on. I had photographs. So this is a photograph from 1902. I also used photographs from 1979. Of course, the camera was not really invented by 1812, so I did use some paintings for that. But this, for example, this is a negative made for American Museum of Natural History by EOH, so that's Edmund Otis Hovey. This is showing secondary eruptions. So it's basically a rootless cone explosion. The Wallaby River, so the western flank. But this is interesting because this negative is actually found in Tempest Anderson's collection in the Yorkshire Museum. So this is why I sought out Edmund Hovey's notebooks, because essentially Edmund and Tempest were talking to one another, and actually they were swapping photographs and negatives, because some of Tempest Anderson's photographs were in Edmund Hovey's collection in America. I also used newspaper articles. This provided kind of like description, sometimes very detailed descriptions of what was witnessed. But even back then, these newspaper accounts were sometimes dramatized and, you know, fluffed up and to sell papers. So as we take a really critical view in terms of, okay, is this telling the truth? Like what really did happen, what didn't happen, and this required lots of triangulation with other sources to pinpoint what was accurate or not. And then because 1979 is still a living memory, I went out to St. Vincent and did some semi-structured interviews, essentially with people all around the island to understand where they were in 1979 and how they responded, essentially, and what did they do to kind of recover from this eruption. 1979, no one died. So it's definitely a different perspective compared to 1812, 1902, where people did die. So the main output from all this information was to produce these eruption impact maps. So these are slightly different from volcanic hazard maps in that I just wanted to know what and where and when sort of information. I was not turning this into risk kind of like factors or vulnerability factors. This is purely giving me a visual representation of what volcanic hazards went where, essentially. So, for example, I would take a description in a source, and this, for example, was a newspaper article. I would locate that on the map. It was it starts off as like drawn kind of like versions of these maps. Of lots of triangulation and kind of like verification and whatnot, I would then digitize the map and then input it into ArcGIS and do georeferencing to map it up with present day kind of like maps of St. Vincent. So here's an overview of some of the stats for 1812. So we went on for 6 weeks. It was on a volcanic explosive index of 4. So in volcanology terms, that's quite small, but in terms for a small island like St. Vincent, that's quite big. It was mainly subplinian, so quite a lot of output of material, and the ash eruption columns and other factors. But these stats in terms of tephra, lahars, and pyroclastic density currents, this is only what I could recover from the archives. So even though I've done a lot to try and understand this eruption, the true picture of the eruption is not complete, and I will discuss that a bit later. But the total population, it was just under 27,000, and the people evacuated, people killed. So this is where the slavery and the colonial kind of like representation of the island really comes forward, because people evacuated were kind of like the overseers and like the plantation slave masters, and essentially white people, and the people killed were slaves. However, that number of people killed, the slaves killed, it probably is not the true value, because slaves were property, not people. So in terms of when plantation owners were saying the estimated losses, they probably included the number of people killed in those monetary values as well. However, I could not distinguish between, you know, in interpreting the monetary value lost into one slave. So that number may be higher, but in terms of, it was around about 54 people, 54 slaves. That is just what's been noted down in terms of these number of people were killed at this location. And in some cases, they didn't provide a location. They just said this number of people were killed. So as I mentioned, I'm going to go through the first week of the eruption, and that's mainly because that's where most of the detail and kind of like timestamps are with what happened. So the eruption starts at on the 27th of April, approximately 12 noon, with ashfall reported at Wallabu, so this is Wallabu here, and Monrond up here, so it's on the western flank. And we don't have any reports for the next few days, but then we actually, on the 30th of April, we have reports of ash falling on Mount Alexander Estate, which is down here, and ash falling on Barbados. We also have a report of felt earthquake in the Monrond area. We also have first reported pyroclastic density currents at 1:30 in the afternoon at Rebecca Estate, which is on the eastern flank, and also the Deux Valleys Estate, which is the northwestern flank. And then later in the day, around 7 p.m. on the western flank, we have a pyroclastic density current reported in the Monrond / Larakai River area. And Larakai River is just north of Monrond. So on the 1st of May, we don't have any reports of anything happening on the islands, but we have reports of ash falling over Barbados at 6 in the evening. We also have reports of ash in the morning falling on Martinique, and ash falling on Dominica in the afternoon, and on St. Lucia and Grenada as well. On the 2nd of May, we have first reports of people entering the northernmost areas. So Fancy is the northernmost village on the island, and then there's also Oia, which is a Kalinago area. And there's reports that that area is completely buried under ash. On the 5th of May, there's reports of ash falling over Barbados between 6:30 in the morning to 12:30 in the afternoon. Again, though, no reports on the island. And on the 7th of May, we have more reports of pyroclastic density currents occurring in Rebecca Dry River Valley. So this is this long river here. And also the Wallabu River, which is this one here. So the pyroclastic density current occurring on the eastern and western flank. However, as you can appreciate, this being so back in time, a lot of reports did not have a timestamp attached to them, so they did not have a date or time to them. But we have there's descriptions of ash fall causing a manager's house to collapse on the Grand Sable estate. So this is a bit on the southeast. We also have reports lots of ash in Truramar estate, which is up here, down to Grand Sable. So this entire area was inundated with ash, and this definitely would correspond to the fact that lots of ash were falling on Barbados. So essentially a lot of eastern kind of like downwind of ash. There's an unknown kind of like earthquake that happens in the Rebecca River Valley area, so around about this area that's felt. We also have other kind of descriptions of pyroclastic density currents impacting Truma, Waterloo Estate, Rebecca, lot number 14, which is just a bit upriver from Rebecca. Also Langley Park, which is kind of like the periphery of the eastern flank, kind of like pyroclastic density current zone. We also have reports on the western flank of pyroclastic density currents occurring on Wallabu, Montrond, Thomas Fraser, which is just slightly north of Montrond, and the Laukai River, which is supplies Thomas Fraser Estate, and then two valleys as well. And we also have a report of a lahar and reports of lahar deposits, sorry, and Truma and Rebecca. And also a report either in 1813 or 1814, a lahar impacts Wallabu and destroys some enslaved huts, enslaved persons' huts. So this is kind of like the output from all that information into the eruption impact map. So these red rings, they represent felt earthquakes. So even though there's no reports of ash falling below this area, we do get a report of a felt earthquake on the 30th of April. Again, this is the felt earthquake in the Rebecca River Valley, also Montrond. The grey is kind of like the ash reports, ashfall reports. The dark orange lines are the lahars, and these orange bits are the pyroclastic density currents. And I'll go into more detail to show you those. So on the left-hand side is the pyroclastic density currents. So you have a mixture of currents that are channelized down river valleys, and this orange one that happened on the 30th at 7 p.m. slightly overspilled into the next river valley. This one's more concentrated. This happened at 1:30 in the afternoon, and this impacted the valleys. And also we have also pyroclastic density currents that blanketed the flanks of the volcano on the east and western flanks. On the right, we have the reports of the lahars. So it looks like 4 river valleys had active lahars. And these happened during the event itself, as this was starting to go into rainy season. So that was an anticipation that that might occur. So on the left-hand side here, I've got a map of St. Vincent and 129 plantation estates from 1801 to 1824. And I overlaid that with the impacts of the earthquakes, ashfall, pyroclastic currents, lahars. So looking at this, there's 9 estates that were susceptible to the greater impacts of lahars and pyroclastic density currents. And on the 9th of November 1812, the governor of the islands wrote to the administrator for the Windward Islands on Barbados, saying that the eruption has overwhelmed and nearly utterly destroyed several plantations and done injury to others. The contents of the volcano covered the earth for a considerable depth, entirely stopped or absorbed the springs of 2 of the largest rivers in the colony from which their mills were supplied with water. And these 2 largest springs, these 2 rivers are the Rebecca River Valley and also the Wallabu River Valley. I want to draw you now to this table. So these are the estimated loss in pounds and shillings for these 9 estates and other estates that have reported that they were impacted. But I want to just draw your attention to some of these. So the Grand Sabal estate, as I mentioned, there was reports of collapse of a roof on the estate. But when I first saw this value, I was unsure about it. I just felt like that's just interesting, considering we had a cluster of estates that are in a direct path of pyroclastic density currents. So the later investigation I found that, so this guy, Thomas Brown, he was a colonel, so he was part of the military. And he essentially had the largest amount of acres on the whole island. So he had a lot of power because he has the most land, and he was in the military. However, the colonial government wanted to buy some of his land to rehouse slaves that were displaced and turn this area into like a village. Thomas Brown, in its colorful racist language, basically was like, no, I'm not having that. But essentially what happened was his own military came in and forced him at gunpoint to give up this land. And essentially some of this money was a way to compensate him for the fact that he gave up some of his lands for these slaves. Another one is Korea. So Korea is interesting because there's no reports of damage to this estate. However, it was abandoned in 1812. And I thought that was rather interesting. But then I found out Korea was owned by W. Mackenzie, who also owned Trurumar. So what happened is Mackenzie sold Korea to fund the repairs at Trurumar because he realized that Trurumar, being on that fertile soil, was more profitable than Korea, which was not on this fertile soil. And then lastly, the two estates confirmed destroyed and abandoned were Thomas Fraser Estate and Duvallies Estate. However, Duvallies does not appear in these estimated losses. But what's interesting is that these two estates prop up by 1902. So in 1902, Thomas Fraser's estate becomes Fraser's Village that belonged to Kalinago, and Duvallies estate became Windsor Forest Estate, which were both then destroyed in 1902 and have now consequently been abandoned, have not been re-inhabited since. So it begs the question whether they learned from 1812 or it was that the benefits of living in this area / producing on this area outweighed the risks. And this graph here, I apologize, it is rather messy, you can't really see it much. But this is a graph of the nine estates highlighted that are closest to La Soufrière. It's the production of sugar by weight. And at the bottom is the year from 1801 to 1824. I just want to draw your attention to 1812. So what happened is most of the states, not all of them, but a lot of them did actually see a fall in production for that year. Some of them more dramatic than others. So this orange one here, for example, is Waterloo. And Waterloo is right in the middle of the pyroclastic desert current path. What happened here is it was a mixture of the areas being destroyed, but also, of course, the loss of labor. So essentially no one was around to actually continue production. But if you see here, by 1813 and beyond, you do see a rise. And in particular for Waterloo, you see a very sharp rise. And this is due to incorporating that new volcanic material into the soil, and of course, replacing lost labor. So in terms of any potential social behaviors observed, so in terms of evacuation, there was no disaster management per se back in 1812. So there was no official order to evacuate these areas. So it was all self-evacuation. But interestingly, Montronde, so Montronde is a Kalinago area, and apologies, this graph, this shows kind of like the 3 eruptions, lahars and pyroclastic currents, overlaid by the what's called the Carib boundary. So basically where this northern area of the island is, in terms of what belonged to the Kalinago and Guafana originally. And here, this in red is the road, the only way to get out if you're in the north, unless of course you have a boat and you may escape by sea. But there's only one road that goes around this area, and essentially it's when did these settlements prop up? And most of them did prop up in between eruptions, maybe or maybe not, considering the risk of the volcano. That is not entirely certain. Anyways, so back to Montmorency. Montmorency, it's an interesting location because they first evacuated days before first ash column collapse that produced the pyroclastic density currents. They first evacuate to Chateau-Belair, which is down here, and then they evacuate down to the capital of Kingstown. And this also occurred in 1902 as well. Again, they evacuated feeling those earthquakes. So before there was going to be pyroclastic density currents. Again, they self-evacuated to Chateau-Belair, then to Kingstown. So unfortunately, as I mentioned, this area is now abandoned and it's not being re-inhabited. And the people who survived in 1902 and the descendants, they were rehoused along the bit further south, just off the map, in a place called Rosebank. And now that's where the descendants live. And essentially, this might be indicated that there was knowledge of their environment and of the volcano in terms of, okay, when we feel these earthquakes and when they're really that big, this is when we need to leave. In terms of resettlement, there's a letter that shows that, a series of letters, sorry, that showed that some Kalinago families that were housed in the fancy Uwea area, it didn't specify where exactly they came from, but essentially in this area, they actually wanted to leave the island altogether, and it was petitioned. The governor and the administrator, on behalf of the Kalinago, requested the governor of Trinidad to house them, and the governor of Trinidad offered them Tobago Island, which at the time was not inhabited. So it's likely Kalinago, these Kalinago that evacuated were the first inhabitants of Tobago Island. And the letter, one of the highlights I put here is that this unfortunate event has struck them with such terror that they cannot be persuaded to settle again in the island, and there is no other crown land near the sea fit for inhabitation. They are therefore anxious to leave for the island of Trinidad. And they were granted that. So I think there's around about 120 families that were allowed to live, move to Tobago, but they had to fend for themselves against a possible Napoleon invasion, which I thought was a bit silly, but that is what it is. In terms of livelihoods, this was a bit hard to figure out because the voices of slaves and free persons like Kalinago and Guafana were pretty much absent in 1812. So it was hard to make a judgment. And in terms of data that does refer to livelihoods, which mainly would have been the agricultural kind of like output that I was interested in, it referred to impacts on jobs being rather general and saying like work much injured, which doesn't tell me much. But we can make the assumption that this eruption did disrupt all aspects of the agriculture and sugar industry in terms of crop and byproduct production, storage, transportation, and trading. And the eruption did temporarily reduce cultivatable land by 60,080 acres. So that did temporarily limit production, but as we've seen, there is an increase even as early as the following year. But the focus was on returning to the status quo rather than what we'd anticipate to see there in terms of adapting and diversifying our crop outputs. In terms of relations to the British West Indies, so in 1812 it was more of a geopolitical connection with the other British West Indies colonies. So, for example, Barbados sent the most aid, and then Britain sent the most aid, and then Jamaica, being the hub for the Greater Antilles, sent aid as well. But this connection transferred more into a kingship, being due to the sharing a common bond and understanding which explains the prompt response of disaster assistance following a disaster in the Caribbean region and the diaspora around the world. And we can see this as recent as the 2020-2021 eruption in the UK, in America, across Europe, where the diaspora is, and other Caribbean islands came to exist as well. At the time when I wrote this thesis, I used the example of Hurricane Irma, and I forgot the other one. But when there was the disastrous hurricane season that impacted Dominica, there was evidence of the Caribbean diaspora in general coming together to raise funds and send it to Dominica. And this island connectivity, before European contact, there's archaeological evidence that the Caribbean Sea was an aquatic motorway, which does contradict the notion of insularity and the framing of island vulnerability, which in itself reinforces the colonial preconceptions of the Caribbean's indigenous past. Okay, so near the end. So to summarize, investigating eruptive history in the background of social change helps to examine how each eruption's impacts can differ. Mixed methods approach in social volcanology requires multiple data sets to be integrated to capture the complexity of living with volcanic eruptions. However, partial records and silent voices mean that the full picture of impacts is never truly complete. The 1812 eruption occurred during the slavery era and after a period of conflict between colonial powers and two cultural groups. So this eruption went on for 6 weeks at the VI4 predominantly, impacting the northern end of the island and neighboring islands. Estimated damages by state owners hid stories of additional financial gain. The sugarcane production decreased but recovered relatively quickly. And Kalinago migrated to Tobago, and some slaves were rehoused at Grand Sable. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Hold on, I'm just going to take you off spotlight in case. Remove spotlight. There we go. Spotlight. There we go. Yeah. So thank you very much for your talk, Dr. Scarlett. Really, really fascinating and interesting to learn how you applied mixed methods to reconstructing volcano eruption. Mm-hmm. So I'll open the floor to some questions, but I'll get the ball rolling and just ask. So now that you've learned all this about San Masort, is it possible to kind of scale that to other future scenarios of different volcanoes and kind of learn about best practices or how you might be able to mitigate other risks for different eruptions?
So yeah, I think there's definitely, someone said they can't hear you.
But you could hear me okay, right?
I can hear you.
Yeah, okay, so it must be on his end. I don't know why he can't hear me. That's a bit bizarre.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say it can, but of course you need to, you need to go through the archives. And of course, is what is there. You can only use what is there. You can't make assumptions in these cases because it's what is written and what is preserved in the written record. So you can do it, and it definitely hopefully, so I'm still writing the paper for this eruption, but I'm hoping it can be like a one way to encourage people to actually explore the archives, because there is a lot of material there, particularly if it's a location that was once colonized by any place that was colonized by a particular power, European empire. There probably is a rich record there available. So I definitely like to feel like I'm an advocate to be like, use archives more, because there's a lot there.
Yeah,
so
I would have. As an engineer, I would have just looked at the quantitative thing. I can't believe that you went through all these diaries and kind of like people's perspective and done the interviews to try and help you model the volcano. It sounds like a really a mammoth undertaking, really. I was quite impressed.
Yeah. So there will be ways you could do it, but obviously it just depends what is there and what kind of questions you want to ask, I suppose, as well. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do we have any?
Yeah, could I ask?
Please. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that there was one eruption or event that was within living memory, and that you went around and talked to people. I forget the adjective you used to describe it, like somehow making me expect less from the effort somehow. So can you contrast? I mean, what's your opinion about what you can learn from people's memories and talking to them, being able to ask, questions specifically, as opposed to what you can glean from diaries and historical records? Which would you prefer to have?
I prefer both. Like, I'm gonna be a bit difficult and say I prefer both, because memory was the thing I was conscious about, because it happened. It was like when I went in 2016, so it happened like around about 36 years ago. I barely remember what happened yesterday. So how I approached it was, when I sat down, the person explained what I want to talk to them about, what not. I just asked an open question and saying, what do you remember? And from what they told me, I would then interrogate more, in particular one part of that story they told. For example, the person I showed in the photograph, he was living in that area, so he was living in that house even 36 years ago, and he was saying that he when he knew that there was an eruption, because there wasn't really, in terms of like communications, they saw it first before it was actually communicated by the government that it was happening. It was kind of strange back then. And he was in Chateau, so he was on the town that's the closest on the western flank to the eruption. Once they knew that was happening, he took his family down south by car to some friends of his in the south, and then he came back and was doing trips back and forth to pick up people in the clinics in the local area, so basically the sick people.
He was affecting an evacuation.
It was pretty much part of the evacuation. He first evacuated his family, then he went back and helped take out people that could not leave as quickly.
I see.
And what I liked about it is that they told the story their own way, and I really love that, because it's surprisingly, the memory is still quite vivid, even though it was 36 years ago. For a lot of people, that it was like, to them, like, some of them would open up like, oh, I remember like it was yesterday, like that cliche kind of like phrase, like, remember it was like yesterday. So in terms of that,
it was a volcano.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting actually, just in terms of something that dramatic and so not ordinary for what they experience in their day-to-day. Like, I really love that they actually remembered their own story in that eruption so well compared to written records. I would say I also appreciate that, because they kind of have more of like, because you could tell like most of the time they actually had time to sit down and write, so they would kind of like there actually was sometimes I saw like scribbles and like things like scribbled out and stuff like that, so like they were trying to articulate, like reflecting back on what they saw in some cases. But of course, for the person in the diary, he was literally just like, he was on his veranda just watching it. So like for him, like, it was like saying like, oh yes, the ash is kind of like getting a little bit heavier now and stuff like that. So no, I think both really work very well, I think.
I remember now the adjective you used. You said semi-structured, I think.
Yes, all right, yes.
And is that a code for something, or should I? What is that?
Sorry, semi-structured means that you kind of answer some questions, but then you kind of like explore those answers further, like in like kind of like you kind of like adapt your questioning basically. So what, in terms of what they say based on the questions you give them, sort of thing.
Right. So I'm just curious, did you undertake an ethics review before? So you did, and was that a painful process, or was it relatively straightforward to?
It was I wouldn't say it was painful, because I had lots of guidance on it, and obviously I wanted to do it right. So of course I was speaking to people, and it was remembering a traumatic event. So basically I had to make sure I had, things in place to kind of like really explain what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. Give them the option that if you want to like opt out at any time, you can. If you want to stop the interview at any time, you can.
Right.
Like and like even afterwards, if you want to like withdraw, you can. And also kind of like a debriefing afterwards. So basically like general, sort of like really basic kind of like psychology
Right.
and psychiatry in terms of how does that make you feel, sort of thing. Just really like get them to like go through the emotions, but really, you know, kind of like safeguard
Right.
that they're retelling and the traumatic experience for them, even though no one died, it was still rather traumatic.
Right. So given the 36-year cooling off period, I assume that nobody did withdraw or have any reservations or something.
Everyone was fine, and they were very willing as well.
Yeah.
Because it is part of their history, and you know, people in the Caribbean. So like my family's from St. Vincent, and like people love to tell stories. So
sure, yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. My grandfather telling me a story. After a while, it's you that's looking at your watch. Get away.
Exactly. Yeah.
So do you think it's possible that those? I mean, as Francis said, we're sort of more data centric, or engineering sort of numbers. Do you think it's possible? Well, how much numerical, hard Scrabble data do you think exists in either narratives that you elicit from human beings or these written records which aren't collected for purpose? Do you think it's well, I mean, obviously you think it's a worthwhile endeavor from a historical point of view. Obviously it is. So do you want to argue that this is the data, that this is what we should be paying attention to, and putting sensors on the summit maybe is less important in some sense? Would you go that far?
I wouldn't, like, obviously it depends on your discipline. So of course for engineers, you rely on that quantitative number of numerical data, and I would not say that's just as valid as this qualitative data I use, and that's just as important to understand the event. I approached it my way because for St. Vincent, there isn't much of that qualitative data. We do have the numbers and geology and whatnot. We are missing that perspective because this is an active volcano and it impacts people. So for me, I find that important. But for example, in the archives, there were numbers that I used, particularly financial like data.
Right.
And there was an engineer who actually, on behalf of the colonial government, went and did his investigations post 1812 eruption, and I've used that in my research. So, and
let me put it this way: do you think? I mean, I think I know the answer. You're going to say yes, of course, but you think there is something missing if we don't collect those narratives?
I think there is. Yeah, I think there is.
Fundamentally missing.
Yeah, you're missing part of the story if you don't include those voices. But it's not to say that you have to do it. That's the thing. Just find a social scientist and get them to do it for you.
Right. Engineers can't have all the jobs, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I mean, sort of obvious answers there. So apologize for my naivete.
That's okay. That's okay. But no, like, I only did this because I'm the kind of person that just likes to do it all, and it's kind of like my background. So like in my undergrad at Coventry, I learned physical geography as well as human geography, as well as disaster management. So I understood the physical side of things and the human side of things, and that's why I took that to my PhD, because like I understand both. But if you can't, it's not the end of the world. You could just find a social scientist, find a historian. Like, you don't have to do it all by yourself.
Thanks.
Do you have any more questions from either Conal or Vladimir? And if not, I'll go back to Scott's first point when you were talking about doing the interviews. I'm curious how you approach that kind of triangulation. Like, I've been doing interviews for my PhD, and I'm left the analysis to the last part because it's been extremely messy. And trying to look at these people's perspective to try and get to the truth of what either happens or what's a common theme, and do that triangulation. I'm kind of like a little bit stuck into how to necessarily find the truth through these people's perspectives. How did you go about it? Was it if 3 or more people agreed on a certain event, then it was like, that's valid? Or
yes, it
would you
was a
take one person's
mixture.
word for it?
Yeah, so it was a mixture. So that's why I had so much data, because I was like, right, I need to have all these accounts to really kind of like see what the timeline is. And from there, it was, feels like so long ago I did this. I mean, it was ish. It was, oh, I've lost my train of thought now. It was, how do I do it? Goodness.
Yeah. Did you use a software, or are you doing it with pen and paper, or?
So I used NVivo and SPSS. So basically I did coding. And of course, then that gave me back kind of like stats in terms of how many times someone said this, and so that across all the data sets. And then also it was a mixture. So for 1812, it was harder because there was no such thing as volcanology or geology back then. So I couldn't rely on scientific reports like I could in 1902 and 1979. So it was really using kind of like this coding approach and be like, okay, this is when they said this, and this is when and how many times it popped up and stuff like that. And yeah, it is tough. This is why as well in my methodology I use the approach and be like, we can accept multiple truths. So I can't remember exactly the type of methodology it was. I can't remember the name of it off my head, but basically, oh yes, so I use feminist standpoint theory, so basically feminist theory, and in this it says that voices are data essentially. So basically, as well as just kind of like using like my trained eye in terms of the newspapers, what was truth, what was not. So this is actually where I got additional training from my third PhD supervisor who uses newspapers a lot. Basically like picking out like just really being critical in approaching what data you're using. But then part of the methodology is now that, well, their voice, their account, their narrative is just as valuable as the next person, sort of thing. So it's kind of like accepting that there's no one truth to it.
Right.
Basically.
So it's quite subjective in some ways.
Yeah, so it is in a sense that except that there are multiple truths essentially to this one event, essentially.
Yeah.
And that
as an engineer, I've been fighting with this because
yeah.
Like, what?
Yeah, and it can be rather controversial in that
it's
sense.
Quite difficult to do when you haven't been trained to do it. You kind of
absolutely.
It's quite new terrain for me personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. It's tough. Like it's so tough. So I would say maybe go back to the beginning. I wouldn't say go back to the beginning, but maybe like to a point where like where you stuck, and maybe just be like, okay, so what if what everyone's saying is true, sort of thing. How does that interpret what I'm seeing, and what happens, sort of thing. And there's this thing in volcanology. I could try and find the paper. I can't remember the top of my head, but there's something called the mismatch effect, which is essentially everyone will experience the same event differently depending where you're physically located, geographically located, sorry. And of course, then that also depends on the individual in terms of what makes them a person, in terms of like their job, their education, where they live, how their relations with their family, like politics and stuff like that. So thinking of all that stuff as well, that actually shows that actually, yeah, there are multiple truths, because people will not experience the same event differently. Like,
of course.
So it's take it from that approach as well, maybe as well. So instead of trying to be like, right, who is telling the truth, maybe be like, okay, what if everyone is telling the truth?
No, absolutely. Yeah. It's just trying to write it into an article in a way that kind of is coherent, and you take everyone's thoughts into kind of appreciation. But some opinions are kind of like people that can be more reactive than others, and it's just quite a complicated process. But it's been great to get some of your insight on that. So thank you very much. Scott is also commenting saying he had to go to another meeting. Thank you for an interesting talk, Jazmin. He said his favourite quote was because the British were not very nice. Congrats on the jobs. To be honest, that made me laugh out loud when you said that as well. So thank you very much. Do we have any last questions from the audience? And if not, we'll wrap up. Okay.
No, just a thank you. I think
okay.
Going up Mount Etna while it was erupting is one of the most impressive things I've ever seen, and the effect it has on the city at the bottom of the hill. You know, if that's your whole island, if this must be, you know, a fascinating topic to research. So very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I love it now. I've been meaning. When I'm always going there, it's not doing anything. So frustrated. Like one day I'm going to go and it's erupting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jazmin. Have a lovely day, and thank you to everyone for attending. Have a lovely day.
Thank you for having me. Bye.